our report focuses on the Copenhagen Accord. That's because the Copenhagen Accord, among other things, accomplished two big things. First of all, as the Finnish minister just mentioned to us, it established for the first time internationally a goal of limiting temperature increase, global average surface temperature increase, to 2 degrees. It's been adopted in some parts of the world, this goal already, but for the entire world, it's the first time that it's ensconced in an agreement. And second of all, it presented the means for achieving this goal by inviting countries to pledge how they would reduce their emissions or control their emissions up to 2020 with regard to this goal. So the obvious question arises, is there a gap between what we're aiming for and where we're headed? That being a very interesting question, many different scientific groups took it on. And that's a good thing because we need a lot of different opinions and a lot of different analyses given the uncertainties. On the other hand, now it's created kind of a proliferation of different estimates. Are we close? Are we far? Are we in between? Whatever. Therefore, the United Nations Environment Programme, together with the European Climate Foundation and the National Institute of Ecology in Mexico, decided it was time to convene the scientists together and assemble their different estimates together and find out what intermediate estimates were, what the range of estimates were. And that's the purpose of this report, to inform the world, policy community, scientific community, of what are the best estimates of where we stand relative to the goals and the aims of the Copenhagen Accord. Now, before we talk about where we're aiming, we have to say where we are. Right now, our emissions, global emissions of CO2 plus other greenhouse gases are around 48. You see the increase despite the fact of the economic recession because of other reasons. Emissions are still on the increase. Now we reviewed the results from 15 different modeling groups on what they said. What are the emission pathways after 2010 that would be consistent with a 2-degree temperature target? And these are the results. This nice curve, this nice green river, these are the majority of results from a variety of different modeling studies and put together the different pathways to show you what the pathway of emissions needs to be, or is consistent at least, with the 2-degree target. You see that the pathways imply that emissions have to peak sometime up to 2020, and after that, by 2050, have to be around 50 or 60% below the levels they were in 1990. Those are robust results from many, many different modeling studies that we assembled. If you look closer, what it says that in 2020, which is also the year pegged for the pledges in the Copenhagen Accord, that an intermediate estimate, I have to stress intermediate because there's uncertainties here and the different groups have different estimates. We were very forward about that in our report, lots of ranges given in our report. Anyway, an intermediate estimate is about 44 gigatons is consistent with a long-term 2-degree temperature goal. Now it becomes interesting. That's what we're aiming for, according to the Accord. Where are we headed? Well, we looked at another set of studies, 13 different groups estimating expected emissions. And they came up with the finding that if we don't carry out any kind of special policies, no action, business as usual, we won't end up at 44 automatically, but the best estimate is we're going to end up at 56. 56. You can do the math. That means a gap of 12 gigatons in 2020. Is that small? Is that big? Well, 12 is about 1/4 of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions now. 12 is the total emissions from all of the power plants in the world right now, the whole energy sector of the whole energy supply sector of the world. 12 is a big number. That may be not the best news, that there would be a gap of 12 between where we may be heading with no action, plus where the emission level that's consistent with 2 degrees, which is around 44. Now the better news is that the issues being discussed on the table in the climate negotiations have the potential to reduce this gap very significantly. If the countries do pretty much the least, there's different kinds of pledges that have been made, you should know, maybe you're familiar. There's unconditional pledges, which the countries have said, we're going to reduce our emissions by a certain amount, irregardless of what other countries do. But they've also have conditional pledges. But if they take the least ambitious pathway, they'll already reduce the gap by 3 gigatons. That's also a big number. If they, however, follow their most ambitious pledges and tighten up the rules having to do with surplus emission credits and other kinds of emission credits, then potential is to get emissions in 2020 down to 49. So let's look at that a little bit more closely. So instead of being at 56, which is the business as usual case, we believe that if the issues on the table having to do with the Copenhagen Accord are addressed by the countries of the world, if they adopt their most ambitious pledges and tighten up the rules having to do with emission credits, we could reduce the gap by 7 gigatons. That's a big number also. That's about roughly the total greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. That's roughly the total greenhouse gas emissions from China. A big number. Now, as I said, we're consistent with the 2-degree limit. We'd like to be at 44. What does it mean? It means that it would bring us, as Achim Steiner already said, 60% of the way towards an emissions level consistent with the Copenhagen Accord goal. On the other hand, the glass is half full but also half empty. It means that there's a remaining gap of around 5 gigatons. That's also a big number. That's about the total greenhouse gas emissions right now from all of the vehicles in the world. Now, just to go through the numbers just once more briefly. 2020, without any action, the best estimate is that emissions would be around 56. The gap would be around 12 gigatons. If countries adopt their low ambitious pledges, which is already on paper in the Copenhagen Accord, can reduce this gap by 3. If they go to the high ambition pledges, we can reduce the gap by an additional 2 to 3. And if they tighten up the rules having to do with emission credits, another 1 to 2 gigatons. They're not fully additive, but our estimate is that the total reduction for all of these different steps would be around 7 gigatons in 2020. To make the point that, yes, the gap would be big in the absence of action, but the issues being concerned in the negotiations by the different countries can make a big difference. It would leave a gap of around 5 gigatons, but also a finding of our study is that it is feasible economically and technically to close even this remaining gap by more ambitious action, especially in the area, for example, of renewable energy and energy efficiency. Last year, the investments in the world were around $162 billion. There is action in renewable energy and clean energy. In that entire renewable energy sector, more than 2 million people are employed worldwide, so it also has a lot to do with building up a green economy. It's possible to close the residual gap and at the same time build up the green economy, providing more jobs that are needed. As well as climate finance, along the lines of being promised in the Copenhagen Accord, would also go a long way to helping these more ambitious actions make them feasible. So, in closing, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just ask you, please mind the gap.